U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to the Middle East again for what will be his fourth visit to the region since Hamas launched a large-scale terrorist attack on Israel on October the 7th last year. Since then, Israel has taken the war to Hamas in Gaza in response. The fallout from that war continues to threaten a wider conflict in the region. Israel said on Monday it was regrouping its forces in Gaza and will change the way it's fighting Hamas, which is seen as a terrorist organization by the US, the EU and many others. In statements toward the end of last year, the US called on Israel to do more to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza. According to Hamas-controlled authorities there, the war has now killed more than 22,000 people. But the first statement from the White House in the new year show continued support for Israel's war goals in Gaza, the destruction of Hamas militarily being high on that list. Here's National Security Council spokesman John Kirby.
We have estimates. I'm loath to put the numbers out there right now because they are just estimates. But Hamas still has a significant force posture inside Gaza. We believe that it is absolutely an attainable goal for the Israeli military forces to degrade and defeat Hamas's abilities to conduct attacks inside Israel. It can be done militarily. Are you going to eliminate the ideology? No. And are you likely going to erase the group from existence? Probably not. But can you eliminate the threat that Hamas poses to the Israeli people? Absolutely.
And joining me now is Shalom Lipner. He worked for 7 consecutive Israeli prime ministers between 1990 and 2016, and he's currently with the Atlantic Council and joins us from Jerusalem. Welcome to the day. Now, the US has questioned Israeli tactics in Gaza, but would Israel have been able to use the force it has without the backing of the US in the first place?
It's good to be with you, Gerhard, tonight. Initially, I think that, the IDF rebounded after the atrocities of October 7th, fell back on a much better footing than it had initially when it was caught by surprise. But I think later it would have been very difficult, close to impossible for Israel to have mounted the effort that we've seen in Gaza without the close assistance of the United States. We've seen over 200 planes of munitions come in to restock Israeli arsenals. We've seen the support the United States has provided on the Security Council to push back against resolutions that have called for an immediate ceasefire. So I think, it's pretty clear right now that, that right now the United States and Israel are closely aligned, at least as far as the campaign is concerned, and then the goal of defeating Hamas, which, of course, the United States and much of Europe, which has defined Hamas as a terrorist organization, would see that as a shared interest of all those parties.
Now, Israel says it's changing its tactics now with a reduction of troops that are actually in Gaza and a shift to tactics which should reduce civilian casualties among Palestinians. Has that shift come in time to prevent President Biden from rethinking his approach to support for Israel?
Well, those channels of communication are open on a constant basis. It would appear so. I think we've seen comments coming out of Washington suggesting that Israel has been receptive to their concerns. As you say, the deployment has moved into to the next phase, as they've defined it now. That many of the reservists are being rotated out, and Israel is moving to more precision operations within the Gaza Strip. Obviously, American concerns that were voiced on the issue of trying to keep non-combatants, keep them away from the fighting and to increase civilian aid. Were heard by Israel as well. There was some pushback about the extent to which that could happen in a war zone, and obviously concerns that if the aid tap was open too far, that could help sustain Hamas in power. But I think that those concerns are being heard here, and I think it's probably safe to say that the United States is, shall we say, relieved that that Israel is moving on to this next phase of the campaign, which hopefully will be a little more. Yeah,
let's look into the future a bit. Can and should Israel formulate what kind of deal it wants with the Palestinians after this war is over?
Well, we've seen a lot of resistance, shall we say, to having discussions in Israel and with Israel's partners about the proverbial day after. Actually tonight, the Security Cabinet, I think, and the War Cabinet, both cabinets will be meeting to actually have that initial discussion, or at least one that they've publicized. It would be virtually inconceivable certainly in terms of Israel's planning and its partners that are on side, that conversation would not happen. I think that there's a definite need for Israel to start talking about not only what it doesn't want in terms of the future of Gaza, but what it would countenance on the ground, what kind of arrangements it does see moving forward to be able to maintain stability and security in that area. I think that if they were not doing that, it would create a dangerous vacuum that that nobody would want to see, and could end us take us places nobody wants to go. I'm sure that those issues will take up will factor prominently in Secretary Blinken's talks when he visits Israel next week.
Now, let's take a quick look at personalities here. President Biden has been a staunch supporter of Israel, as Israel could wish for over the course of his career. But can Israel rely on such strong backing from U.S. politicians in the long term?
President Biden, a remarkable ally for Israel. As you say, we were talking earlier about pushing back against calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza right now, which have been brought some price to the Security Council. I mean, that would leave over 150 hostages in Gaza. It would leave Hamas in power in Gaza, amid promises that they've made or pledges to repeat the events of October 7th until, Israel were destroyed. So that's been hugely important to Israel. I think it's even more extraordinary under the political circumstances, given the political circumstances in which we operate. I mean, President Biden is on the cusp or in the middle of a 2024 election campaign. His Israel policy is not all that popular within certain quarters of his party. So he's had to do this on force of conscience and, of course, his belief that this is the right thing for the United States, even when there's been pushback. So, I don't think Israel can be certain that any successor in his chair would maintain the level of support that Israel has seen from him on a personal level. No.
Let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu. He is a divisive figure in Israel too. The judicial reforms are a case in point. If Israel needs to focus more on national security in the future than politics, as you have written, can it do that with Netanyahu?
That's a hugely important question. I think that the unity of purpose that we've seen in Israel during this campaign is under threat, as you say, again, from sort of partisan wins. Judicial reform, elements of the reform are back on the table again. There were a couple of Supreme Court rulings this week which forced that back into front of the frame. We've had disputes of budgeting priorities with sort of patronage issues being fed into the budget at the time when Israel was trying to fund an expensive war. So, there are a lot of questions about whether or not Israel is capable of doing that. Clearly, as long as it does not get a handle on that problem and does not prioritize national security over these political issues, I think that it risks undermining the solidarity that will allow for this campaign to continue. I think it would probably also draw into question the sustainability of this government coalition over time. At a time when you say there's divisiveness in Israel, and people will not be willing to rally to the flag under circumstances such as those.
Now, if we're looking at Israel's deep alliance with the U.S. that it still currently has, which could, of course, change depending who is at the top there in the U.S., does Israel really have any alternative to this friendship, this support with and from the United States?
Sure. Not really, I would argue. And in the article that I just written last week, I think that, whereas we've seen other parties in the Middle East maybe hedging their bets with the Russians or with the Chinese, I don't think that's really a viable option for Israel. Beijing and Moscow have been supportive of Hamas. They've been pushing back against, Israel's priorities in the Security Council. They certainly would not be delivering the levels of aid which, Israel has enjoyed and has received from the United States that have allowed this campaign to continue. So I mean, for the time being, for the foreseeable future, I don't think that, Israel has another viable option to its alliance with the United States now.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to the Middle East again within the next few hours. It's his fourth trip since Hamas launched a large-scale terror attack on Israel. DW correspondent Benjamin Alvarez Gruber is in Washington and follows this story for us. Benjamin, what does Blinken hope to achieve this time?
There will be several stops here, but what's more interesting than the countries that he's visiting, so he's visiting a lot of allies, a lot of actors in the region. We have Turkey, Greece, Jordan, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, of course, Israel, the West Bank, and also Egypt, is the fact that he's now going to Lebanon. We were just speaking about that, the fears that the assassination of the Hamas leader might lead to a broader confrontation. So it's interesting that he's not going there. Today there was a briefing of the State Department. The spokesperson said that there are several issues on the agenda that they expect also to have tough calls with many of his other counterparts. They will speak about how to get more aid, humanitarian aid into Gaza. They will speak about the hostages, also what will happen after the war. So there will be several talks here on the agenda. Because for Blinken, also the criticism here in Washington is increasing with more people saying and more politicians here saying that the US needs to put real red lines and not just putting out statements saying that they are deeply concerned, but actually putting more red lines, for example, for weapons exports for Israel.
Now, about the future of the Gaza Strip, the State Department has harshly criticized the two Israeli ministers for calling Palestinians to leave Gaza. Do you think that he will reinforce that message?
That's what the spokesperson said today. We had this press release only a few days ago criticizing exactly the statements of the two Israeli ministers. As you said, the US State Department said that there are disagreements between Israel and the United States, and also that the US rejected the inflammatory and irresponsible statements from the government. So that will be definitely something that they'll talk to with their Israeli counterparts to see how to go further. We have to remember that the US is right now bypassing Congress to get weapons to Israel. That's something also that is raising concerns here. So he will be sure to press that also with Israel and also with the other partners there. But we know that the US is not happy with the way that this is developing. And they will have harsh words with the Israeli counterparts, as what the State Department spokesperson said earlier today.
Now, Blinken will also be in the West Bank to talk to the Palestinian Authority. What will be his message there?
He met Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Autonomic of the Palestinian authorities. There, he met him in November. They spoke about violence against settlers in the West Bank, and also that it's important for them to reassure that the U.S. remains committed to advancing tangible steps for a Palestinian state, and that's something that the U.S. has repeatedly said, that Gaza is Palestinian, will remain Palestinian. And that's something that he will need to talk to, not only with Israeli politicians, but also with the Palestinian authorities that he will meet in the West Bank.
Benjamin Alvarez Gruber there for us in Washington. Thank you, Benjamin.